Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to dive into a story that's really got both. It's heartbreaking, and it really makes you think.
Mm.
You might have already heard about Peanut, this squirrel. He was internet famous, over 500,000 Instagram followers, and tragically, he was taken from his home and euthanized.
Yeah, Peanut's story, it was all over the headlines. And, it's a very emotional story, but it also kind of gives us a chance to peek into what happens with bureaucracy sometimes, those things that we don't always see.
Right. Yeah. So for those of you who haven't heard this story, we were talking about, like I said, this pet squirrel, super beloved, living his best life with his owner, Mark Longo, and they even had this raccoon buddy, Fred. I mean, living the dream. But then the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, or DEC, gets involved. What happened?
So it looks like it all started with some people complaining to the DEC about Peanut and his raccoon friend, Fred. And these complaints, they were anonymous, but it triggered this whole raid on Longo's home. It's pretty unbelievable. At least 6 DEC officers showed up to take the squirrel.
6 officers.
Yeah.
Like, really? Wow. For one squirrel. Yeah, I mean, we've got the sources right here, and even Congressman Langworthy called out the DEC for this. He said, they've got their priorities completely backwards.
Yeah, it does seem like a bit much, especially when you consider that Longo is actually in the process of getting Peanut certified as an educational animal. So this wasn't just like some random squirrel that was causing trouble.
So sad. It's heartbreaking, Longo was just totally blindsided by this raid and then absolutely devastated when they took Peanut and Fred away. I mean, what did the DEC say? Like, what was their reasoning for doing all of this?
Well, officially they said it was because somebody got bitten by Peanut while they were investigating. And they said they needed to test him for rabies. Of course, that meant that both Peanut and Fred were euthanized.
Wow. Okay, so that's the immediate tragedy, right? We have a beloved pet, a crazy raid, a bite, and then they're euthanized. But we're here for the deep dive. What's the bigger picture here?
That's exactly right. So while this is a horrible incident, it really does raise a much bigger question. This whole idea of unchecked bureaucracy, this unchecked growth, and how it can basically just crush individuals.
So we're not just talking about one squirrel here. We're talking about a system that's maybe totally out of control. What do we see in these sources about that?
Well, look at how much bureaucracy has grown just in the last few decades. So you've got the Federal Register, which is basically this huge collection of all the federal regulations. It's gotten 10 times bigger since the late 1950s. That's 10 times the rules and regulations.
10 times? Oh my gosh. So everything's like 10 times harder, more complicated.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's not just the federal level. Think about the Department of Agriculture. Our sources point out that between 1952 and 1972, the number of farms and farmers in the U.S. actually went down.
Right.
Way down. But the number of people working for the Department of Agriculture went up in the same period.
Wait. So you're saying there were fewer farms and farmers, but more people in the department that was supposed to be managing them?
Exactly. And, this is a classic example. Bureaucracy just seems to keep growing, whether it's actually needed or not. More regulations, departments get bigger. It's like this thing with a life of its own.
Okay, so we've got all these regulations, these big departments, tons of people, and maybe not even a real need for it all. Where does Peanut fit into this?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? The system's so big and so complicated, it's almost impossible to tell who is actually making decisions. So in a way, nobody's really accountable, but the machine just keeps going.
So are you saying that nobody at the DEC maybe actually wanted to euthanize Peanut, but the system itself just made it happen?
Yeah, kind of makes you think, right? The rules were already in place, they followed the procedures, so this outcome, as tragic as it was, it almost had to happen.
And we are back for more of the deep dive. So we just got done talking about poor Peanut and how his story really shows us some of the dangers when we just let bureaucracy go unchecked.
Yeah, and Peanut's case. It might seem extreme, but this kind of thing where bureaucracy just goes too far, it actually affects all of us in ways that we don't even realize.
So it's not just squirrels and raccoons. It's about everyday life. Can you give us some examples of how this affects, the average person?
Sure. Think about all of the rules and regulations that we live with all the time, from the food we eat to the cars we drive to businesses. There are so many regulations, and a lot of them just seem to make things more complicated, and they don't really make anything better.
Okay. Yeah, I get that. But some regulations have to be important, right? We need rules.
Yeah.
To keep people safe and to make sure that everything runs smoothly.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, some regulations are super important. But when you have a system like we were talking about, where this giant rule book, the Federal Register, has just exploded like 10 times bigger in just a few decades. It makes you wonder.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. 10 times the rules.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe that everything is actually 10 times safer now
Yeah.
or more efficient. What is the real impact of all these rules?
Well, one of the biggest impacts is the cost. They estimate that bureaucratic waste, it just eats up something like 17% of the entire U.S. GDP every year. That is a huge amount of money that could be used for so many other things, like healthcare, education, or even paying off some of the national debt.
17%. Are you serious? Man, that's a crazy number. It sounds like we're paying a really high price for all this bureaucracy. But how does that play out in real life? I mean, for regular people?
Well, for one thing, it can really make it hard for new businesses to get started. Like if somebody wants to start even a small business, forget about it. Mountains of paperwork, permits, licenses, it can just be overwhelming and make people give up.
So it's like the system is fighting against them before they even get going. But what about people who aren't starting businesses? I mean, how does this affect them?
It affects everyone in tons of ways, often in ways they don't even realize. For example, too many regulations. It drives up the prices of things that we buy and services that we need, and they create all these delays and roadblocks if you're trying to get some kind of essential service or you're dealing with a government program.
Oh, man. So it's like this hidden force that's making things more expensive, slowing everything down, and just making life more difficult for everybody.
Exactly. And it really leads to this feeling of being powerless,
Mhm.
feeling frustrated and like you're just trapped in a system that doesn't care.
Oh, yeah, I get that. We've all been there, right?
Right.
Dealing with bureaucracy. I mean, waiting on hold forever or filling out endless forms. You can't even get a straight answer. It's exhausting.
It is. And this whole feeling of being powerless, that's actually a key part of what makes bureaucracy so dangerous. Because when people feel like they have absolutely no control over the systems that are basically running their lives, it can lead to just giving up, not caring anymore, feeling resigned.
Wow. So we're not just talking about the money or, things not being efficient. We're also talking about people losing their sense of, being able to do anything
Yeah.
and feeling hopeless. It's kind of dark.
It is. And that's exactly why it's so important to understand how this can happen, how bureaucracy can impact our lives, and how to fight back against it when it gets out of control. We just can't accept this. Like, it's normal.
Okay, so I think I'm getting this now. This bureaucratic monster, it's out of control and it's doing some pretty bad things. But what can we actually do about it? I mean, how can we possibly fight something that big?
Well, it's definitely a challenge, but it's not impossible. There are things we can do individually and things we can do together to try to get a system that works better, a system that's accountable, a system that's built for people.
Okay, give us some hope here. What are some real things that people can do to actually fight this thing, this bureaucratic leviathan?
Well, for one thing, we have to make sure people know about this. Stories like Peanuts, even though they're sad, they can really show people how dangerous things can get when we don't control this kind of bureaucracy.
Okay, so we need to talk about it more, share these stories, make sure everyone understands. What else? What else can we do?
Another thing that's really important is to try to change the regulations themselves.
And is.
We need to fight for regulations that are easier to understand, that are clear and efficient, regulations that actually help people instead of making everything more complicated.
So it's not about getting rid of every single regulation. It's about making sure they're actually good and not just making things harder for no reason. How do we make that happen? How do we make these changes?
That's where we all need to get involved. We have to speak up. Let our elected officials know what we think. Support the organizations that are working on this problem and talk about it. Talk about these issues with other people.
Okay, so we need to learn about it, speak up, contact the people who represent us, support the right groups. It's like we need to attack this from all sides. Is there anything else we can do, like on our own?
Absolutely. We can practice what I call bureaucracy busting in our own lives. What I mean is be informed, know the rules, know your rights, and don't be afraid to say something if you think something is unfair.
I like the bureaucracy busting.
Yeah.
It's like we need to be really smart about how we use government services. We need to know the rules of the game and not let the system walk all over us.
Right. Exactly. It's about taking control, not just giving up.
That's such a great point.
Thank
Especially when we're talking about something as huge and impersonal as bureaucracy, it's easy to feel like there's nothing we can do, but we really do have more power than we realize.
You're totally right. And that's why it's important to remember that even small things can make a difference. When we become informed and get involved, even small actions, they all add up. And we can all work together to make the system better. A fairer system, a system that works, and a system that's built for people.
Okay, so we've talked about the problem, how it affects us, and some ways to try to fix it. What else can we learn from Peanut's story? What kind of deeper questions does it raise?
That's exactly what we'll be talking about in the final part of the deep dive. We'll look at the emotional side of Peanut's story, what it meant to people. We'll talk about the ethics of animal welfare. And we'll tackle this really big question of how we value and protect all living things, not just humans.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. So we have covered so much in this episode. We started with Peanut's story, then that led us to this whole problem of runaway bureaucracy, and then we even talked about some things we can do to push back,
Yeah.
fight the system a little bit.
Yeah, and now we kind of want to step back and think about, what does this all mean? What can we learn from this? Peanut was so much more than just a squirrel, right? He was a pet that people loved, he was famous online, and he really shows us how this kind of system, this bureaucracy, can just steamroll anybody, even a cute little squirrel.
It's true. When you read through all of these sources and you see what people were saying online, oh my gosh, Peanut really touched a lot of people. People were really, really sad. Even people who'd never even met him.
Yeah, and it shows you how powerful these connections can be, in this digital age. We can form these really strong bonds with people online, even with animals like Peanut. And that's something that would have been impossible, just a few decades ago.
And his story really hit home for people because it just felt so unfair.
Yeah.
Here's this happy little squirrel, not hurting anybody, just living his life, and all of a sudden this giant system just rolls right over him with these terrible consequences.
It really does make you think about some hard questions, like how much do we value animals? How much do we care about what happens in individual cases? And are our systems even capable of being compassionate?
Yeah, because to the system, Peanut was just a number, right, a file, maybe a rabies risk. But to Longo and all of his fans online, he was family. It's like this huge disconnect, like a total lack of empathy.
Yeah.
And that's really unsettling.
And that's one of the scariest things about bureaucracy. It can just kind of turn everybody into numbers and categories. It doesn't see people as individuals. And it forgets about all of the little details of people's lives and experiences.
Yeah, it's like by trying to be totally fair, it ends up being heartless.
Yeah.
There's no room for exceptions, no room for compassion, just rules and procedures, and then whatever happens, happens.
Exactly. And this brings us back to what we were talking about before, how important it is for people to be able to make decisions, to think for themselves, and to have the courage to say no to a system that's become too rigid, too unfeeling.
Yeah, because if we all just follow the rules without ever thinking about what they mean or how they affect people, if we never make exceptions and never show compassion, then we all just become parts in a giant machine. And that machine could do some really terrible things.
Peanut's story. It reminds us that our actions really do matter. Even in a world with all of these rules and this crazy system, it matters when we speak up, when we question things, and when we fight for transparency and accountability. Those things can actually make a difference.
Yeah, it's about remembering that behind all those case files, all those statistics, there's a real living being with their own story. Doesn't matter if it's a squirrel named Peanut or a person who's trying to deal with this messed up system. We have to remember that. We have to see the individual, not just the category.
And we have to fight for systems that are built on compassion, systems that are fair and flexible. And we have to remember that the rules are supposed to help us. We're not supposed to be serving the rules.
That's a great point. And I think, we've come to the end of our deep dive here. We started with Peanut's story, and then we talked about how bureaucracy has gotten out of control. And we even discussed some things that we can all do to try to make a difference.
It's been a really tough conversation. I mean, it's a sad story, but it's so important. And hopefully Peanut's story will help people understand this issue. And it will make all of us think more critically about the systems we create and how they affect the lives of, everybody, humans and animals.
I think so, too. And on that note, it's time to say goodbye. But as we sign off, I just want to leave you with this. Don't forget about Peanut. Let his story remind you to stay informed, stay engaged, and never give up fighting for a better world. A world where we value compassion and where we use common sense, even when we're dealing with these huge systems that can feel so impossible to change. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive, everybody. We'll see you next time.